Hi, my name is Katherine, and today I will be talking about racial inequality as a consequence of gentrification in school funding, along with my colleagues on this project, Samshita and Gabrielle. Before we begin, I would like to thank General Intelligences for giving us the opportunity to work together in this very important project, and thank you to the audience for your time. I also want to give a brief roadmap of what we'll be talking about in regards to the extent of gentrification effects on school funding. First, we'll be reviewing racial inequality through racial injustices in general, and then move forward to more particular impacts in an educational setting. Then Samshita will explain more about gentrification, and Gabrielle will tie in the relationship and the correlation between gentrification on school funding and unequal treatment seen across people of color, particularly Black people. To have a better idea of what racial injustice exactly is, Merriam-Webster provides us with a definition. Racial injustice is defined as being treated unequal or even uneven based on race. Now, we have seen examples of this in recent civil unrest through the Black Lives Matter movement and the impacts that this pandemic currently has on marginalized communities. More examples can even be seen through the following. So we have the death of George Floyd that spurred another movement through the Black Lives Matter movement. We know that 61 cents are paid for Black people. For every dollar, 40% of homeless population is Black, 30.8% of African Americans have a college degree. Police brutality has been an ongoing trend towards people of color, denying service based on skin color. And other impacts that we see for racial injustice includes injustice to innocent citizens, protests, growing up in poorer neighborhoods, unequal pay, limitation to resources, lower education quality, unemployment, limitation of opportunity, and that's really just a few of the many examples that exist in real life and continue to affect many folks who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. One of the most important areas where this takes place and influences most individuals is in the educational setting. So, for racial injustice in the educational systems, we can see that people of color experience higher rates of poverty and thus they struggle more academically. So we have racist policies and biases that widen the achievement gap. A report by the Government Accountability Office found that Black students in K through 12 schools are far more likely to be disciplined, whether through suspension or referral to law enforcement, than their racial counterparts. In 2014, a study found that people generally viewed Black boys as older and less innocent starting from the age of 10. Another study from 2017 produced similar results and find that Americans overall view Black girls as less innocent and mature for their age from age 5 to 14. We also see that access to quality of education changes with poverty and minority status. State racial achievement gaps are strongly correlated with state racial socioeconomic disparities. Poor people achieve worse academic outcomes than wealthier people. Living in poverty means less access to healthcare, neonatal care, pre-kindergarten, and fewer books in the home. It often means that fewer educated family members to serve as a model, and it often means that suffering from malnutrition and psychological trauma. Impoverished parents usually have to work multiple jobs just to make ends meet and then have less time to help with homework or even see their children. And all of this has an impact on education. Something else I want to point out is the school-to-prison pipeline. Defined by the Justice Policy Institute, the school-to-prison pipeline is known as the intersection of strict school disciplinary policies and law enforcement policies to feed young people in public schools into the criminal punishment system. So, who might be impacted? This includes students from two groups, racial minorities and children with disabilities. They are disproportionately represented in the school-to-prison pipeline. African American students, for instance, are 3.5 times more likely than their white classmates to be suspended or expelled, according to a nationwide study done by the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights. And in case you haven't noticed already, what is the issue? There's a lack of special needs services, a lack of basic health care, learning disabilities, homelessness, hunger, and poverty, which all often manifest themselves as disruptive behavior in the classroom. But instead of getting the students the help they need, they're criminalized for it. And even after taking in achievement, socioeconomic status, self-reported behavior, and teacher-reported behavior into account, Black students are still punished disproportionately. Students who are suspended are more likely to drop out of school and have run-ins with the juvenile justice system, a pattern that has been documented so well that now it has its own name, which is the school-to-prison pipeline. And unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. So, in regards to racial disparities in pain treatment, half of white medical trainees believe myths such as Black people having thicker skin or less sensitive nerve endings than white people. And to just clarify, these disparities in pain treatment are not intentional. The healthcare providers don't deliberately decide, oh, one group deserves this pain relief while the other doesn't, or one should suffer more than the other. It's really just the inequities because of complex influences. And this means that the providers might have implicit biases that they don't even know they have. So providers, they're not immune to stereotypes and images that are often portrayed in the media, which tend to associate African Americans with substance abuse. A study done in 2019 asked subjects to identify pain expressed in photos, and they found that white participants more readily recognize pain on white faces than Black faces. So even though providers might like to believe that they don't have any unconscious biases, the research shows that they are just as likely as others to do so. Unfortunately, there are so many places that we still have to work on, and that's only focusing on the educational sector. And there are so many other factors that contribute to make this worse, which is why my colleague, Samshita, will go into more detail when explaining gentrification.
Hi, my name is Samshita Maram, and I will be talking to you about gentrification. So, what is gentrification? Gentrification is defined as a process in which the middle class and the wealthy move into a lower income area and build businesses, companies, and renovate the homes, resulting property value increasing and replacement of poor residents. So, here are a few basic facts about gentrification. So 20% of low-income areas have experienced gentrification since 2000, in contrast to only 9% of these areas in the 1990s. Half of the national gentrification comes from New York, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Baltimore, San Diego, and Chicago. A major cause of gentrification is because of racist bank-imposed economic policies, who want to kick people of color out of their homes and allow the companies and schools and offices to build and gentrify an area. People of color experience gentrification more because, as statistics show by the National Equity Atlas, show that these families are represented more in poor areas. Gentrification also has many impacts on people who experience it. It affects many factors of life, such as health, education, income, social and economic status, etc. Low-income families experiencing gentrification can have a change in stress levels, mental health, panic attacks, etc. Gentrification is the first step to creating a world that only supports the rich and middle class and eliminates housing and a way of life for the unfortunate, because the rich get to transform areas that are suitable for them and eliminate the poor since they're making places unfit for them to live in. Gentrification can also cause homelessness because people who live in poorer areas already do not have enough money to live in a stable neighborhood, so being placed out of these homes as well will leave them on the streets in most cases. So, how does gentrification affect school funding? Public school students largely receive educations of different quality depending on local school district funding, location, and resources. Although school resources come from a variety of governmental sources, most funding comes from property taxes based on local real estate property values. Property values vary a great deal by neighborhood in that homes located in the suburbs, typically occupied by whiter, wealthier families, tend to have higher property values than those located in inner city neighborhoods, occupied by poorer minority families. Income and wealth differences in richer suburbs versus poorer urban neighborhoods have a major effect on the funding local schools receive. Students in urban schools do poorly on standardized tests when compared with their richer suburban counterparts, not because the individual students are inferior, but because the gap in resource allocation between urban and suburban schools is so large. If richer families move in, the taxes will be higher and the school will receive more funding, since all the lower income families were displaced because of gentrification, and richer family property values are higher, making school funding higher too. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Gabrielle Pearl. Before I begin this presentation, I would like to give a little background information on myself. I am 26 years old. I completed my Bachelor's of Science in Biology and my Bachelor's of Arts in Psychology in 2019 at Columbia College of Missouri and will be applying to medical school next year. I have served in the Air Force for 9 years and was actually deployed for the first half of this experience. I am in Group 40, and my teammates are Katherine and Samshita. I would like to say thank you to them for their patience over the course of this journey, along with a huge thank you to the individuals that allowed this opportunity to take place. Without further ado, I will begin my presentation. Today, I will be discussing how gentrification affects school funding. In addition to focusing on the ways in which gentrification affects school funding, this presentation will also briefly go over what issues have arisen among students who are victims of gentrification and the alternative to public neighborhood schools. As my members mentioned earlier in the presentation, gentrification is a process by which the middle and wealthy class move into lower income neighborhoods to build businesses and to renovate homes. These actions create increased property value and the displacement of low income households. Pictured here is a group of Chicago students protesting against the closing of their school. Alongside it is a quote written by Tom Slater that simply states, by only examining the social and spatial processes that play out in these redeveloped areas, we neglect to take into account how the gentrification process reshapes the spaces in a neighborhood that remain underdeveloped, thus ignoring the voices and experiences of the longtime resident community who often inhabit them. While some lawmakers may reason that gentrification itself is necessary in underdeveloped neighborhoods, there are many families who would disagree. There are a number of potential hardships that must be taken into account when gentrification is discussed in poorer communities. Primarily, for example, the amount of time it may take for students to grow accustomed to not only a different neighborhood, but also to a different school. I hope everyone brought their game face tonight for the chance to win the grand prize of $1 million on tonight's episode of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? You must answer the following question accurately. How much does the U.S. federal government contribute to funding U.S. public schools? Your options are A, 15%, B, 8%, C, 2%, or D, 30%. If you answered B, you are correct. Approximately 8% of funds generated by property tax are provided by the U.S. federal government. State and local governments contribute the remaining balance needed to fund each student in U.S. public schools. The education of students living in low income neighborhoods is oftentimes neglected. Minority students who attend public schools receive a different level of educational resources based on where the district allocates school funds. The amount of funding neighborhood schools receive is directly linked to the amount of wealth that exists in that community. Gentrification has on low income households isn't very high statistically, yet the frequent movement to different neighborhoods has been shown to have harsher academic outcomes for minority students. Schools with a higher number of low income students are faced with teachers that have less experience and a greater occurrence of turnover. There is current evidence that suggests gentrification has increased the rate of college completion of some students that come from less educated households. However, there is a clear resource gap that exists in urban communities versus suburban communities. For many years, Washington, D.C. had been known as the first city in the United States that consisted of mostly blacks. However, this number decreased drastically by 2011. Many researchers tied this trend to the public schools in D.C. that had been shut down to create charter schools. Charter schools have become the norm over the past 30 years in larger U.S. cities. These institutions are privately run and publicly funded. Regulations within charter schools oftentimes deviate from those that exist in public schools. For example, teachers are not required to be licensed in the state they teach in. The curriculum of a student's class is dependent upon the teacher's discretion. There are different qualifiers to getting entry into a charter school, including lottery drawings and entrance exams. When school enrollment decreases, it is at the district's discretion as to whether the institution will continue receiving the same amount of resources. Unfortunately, in most instances, the amount of resources and funding decreases in gentrified communities, while middle class and high class households drive its value up. Oftentimes, the same individuals that choose to move to gentrified neighborhoods do not have children. This too explains why the enrollment rate drops dramatically. If lawmakers took the necessary steps to ensure low income families could remain in their neighborhood at an affordable rate, we could likely observe the benefits of gentrification. However, gentrification has contributed very little to the academic success of students who come from lower income households. In fact, displacing students from communities in which they grow up in has had psychological effects on some students. It is with great hope that you all took away something new from this presentation.